In this video, we're going to explain how the law of independent assortment governs our inheritance. Law of independent assortment is the third and last law of inheritance proposed by Gregor Mendel, and it states that alleles separate independently from other pairs of alleles, which means if you inherit a certain allele from one trait, it does not affect the other alleles you inherit. So, as you can see, let's take a look again at your chromosomes with two chromatids. So, uh, if if this locus is a locus for the character, which is the color of the flower, there are also other locus which is intended for another characteristics, like the color of the seeds and the shape of the seeds. So in law of independent assortment, it just states that uh, they do not affect one another. Okay, they are sorted independently uh, from each other. Okay, so in the example that we're gonna use in this video, we're gonna use two other characteristics. We're gonna go back with the example of Rigor Wendell, which is the pea plant, but this time we're not gonna use the color of the flower, but we're gonna use the other characteristics of the pea plant, which is the color of the seed and the shape of the seed. So there are two characteristics involved here already, not just one characteristic, and those are color of the seed and the shape of the seed. So each characteristics has two traits. For the color of the flower, for the color of the color of the seed could either be yellow, which is symbolized with capital Y, that means yellow is dominant, and green, which is symbolized by small letter y. Again, they belong to the same locus, which is color of the seed, so they should have the same letter. Yellow is dominant, so it has the capital Y, and green is the recessive one, so it has the small y. The other characteristic is the shape of the seed, and the traits for these characteristics are either round, which is the capital R, that means it's the dominant, or wrinkled, small r, which means it's the recessive one. So again, they have the same letter, which is R, because they belong to the same locus, which indicate the one characteristic, which is shape of the seed. All right. So capital R for the round, dominant trait, and small r for the wrinkled, which is recessive trait. So we can see here in this picture, but it's a bit different because the author used S instead of R, but it's all right. Okay, we're just gonna use R to be consistent with the rule that commonly, or the common rule, that we use the first letter of the dominant trait. So in here, R is the dominant, or round is the dominant trait. So we're going to use letter R. So ignore the letter S because we're going to use letter R all throughout the video. Okay. So let's now proceed with the next slide. Okay, now we're going to use this example because it produced the most possible number of offspring. Okay, so let's say that your father has heterozygous allele for color. So this heterozygous means it's yellow, all right, because it's heterozygous. And heterozygous for the shape of the seed, which means it's round. So we have uh, yellow and round seed, or yellow round seed for father. And then, because the mother has the same genotype, it should also have the same phenotype, also yellow and brown seed. Now, the challenge is to determine what are the possible uh, alleles or combination of alleles that could be passed on? So, since they are independent to one another, it doesn't mean that the father has dominant uh, allele for color and dominant allele for shape, and also recessive allele for color and recessive trait allele for shape. Then they should pair up already. It doesn't mean it's always gonna be like this. All right. So since they are independent to one another, other possibility would be the dominant would be paired up with the recessive trait of the other characteristic, and the recessive for color could pair up with the dominant trait or uh, the shape. So since they have the same uh, genotype and phenotype, then the possible alleles will be the same for the mother. All right. So these four possibilities are the one we're gonna put in here. So this is the spot for the father. Okay. So we're gonna have both dominant, both recessive. The first one is dominant, the second one is recessive, the first one is recessive, the second one is dominant. You might think, oh, I should put the capital R first before the small y. It doesn't work that way because uh, they belong to different locus. All right. So you should have to do it in order. If the color of the seed comes in first, even if it's recessive, then you should have to write it first. All right. It's not like the heterozygous. This is not called heterozygous because it's not a pair of allele. It's just two single allele put together. All right. So they still belong to one chromatid. Okay, but two locus. You see what I mean? So let's copy the chromosome in here for you to visualize it. So that means uh, these two are separated. Okay. So this Y and R in here belongs to just one chromatid. Same thing with this. All right. There are just several possibilities. It's possibility that all dominant allele goes in here and the rest goes in here. All recessive alleles goes in here, the rest goes in here. Same thing with this. All right. So these are just possibility because they sort themselves independent to one another. So we have to know all the possibility. So since the same situation is present on the mother, we're just gonna copy. All right. Now we're now gonna create or know all the possible offspring. So this is now where you're gonna apply how you write the heterozygous, which is the capital letter comes in first. All right. Now let's start with this first. So it's like you're multiplying using the multiplication table, if you remember that. All right. So coming from the father, coming from the mother, we only have both dominant allele for the color, which is yellow. So we're going to write yellow. And then both dominant for the shape. So we're going to have both dominant for the shape. So the phenotype of this is yellow round. Okay. We're going to make it all small so everything can fit. All right. Okay, next would be we have now recessive and dominant for color. But then again, the capital comes in first, even if the dominant comes from the mother and the recessive comes from the father. Same thing with the shape. So since it's a heterozygous, we're going to follow the dominant trait, which is yellow and round. Okay, this one, dominant, dominant, recessive, dominant. So we have heterozygous, homozygous dominant for yellow, we're going to have yellow. Heterozygous for shape, we're going to have the round. So recessive, dominant, we're going to have heterozygous. Dominant, dominant, we're going to have homozygous dominant. So we have yellow and brown. So in the first row, you will see that the phenotypes are the same even if the genotypes are different. Okay, let's now go to the second. So in the second row, you have dominant, recessive, so heterozygous, dominant, recessive, also heterozygous. Both are yellow and brown. We have recessive, recessive, homozygous, recessive. Recessive, recessive, homozygous, recessive. So we now have, since these are homozygous recessive, it's no longer yellow but green. And since this is already homozygous, recessive for shape, this is now no longer round but wrinkled. All right. Okay. Next would be dominant, recessive, heterozygous. Recessive, recessive, homozygous, recessive. So we now have yellow and wrinkled. Recessive, recessive, homozygous, recessive, dominant, recessive, heterozygous. So we have now green, brown. Next would be dominant, dominant, homozygous, dominant, dominant, recessive, heterozygous. So you have yellow, brown. Recessive, dominant, heterozygous. Again, the capital letter comes in first. And then recessive for R, homozygous recessive. So we have yellow, wrinkled, dominant, dominant, homozygous dominant, recessive, recessive, homozygous recessive. So we have yellow, wrinkled, seed. And then we have recessive, dominant, heterozygous for color, and then dominant, recessive, also heterozygous. So remember, even if the recessive for color comes in first and the dominant comes in second, we still wrote it this way. So it's yellow, brown, right? Last row. So we have dominant, recessive, heterozygous, dominant, dominant, homozygous dominant. We have yellow, brown. Okay? And then recessive, 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 dominant, heterozygous. And then we have green, brown. Next would be dominant, recessive, heterozygous. Recessive, dominant, heterozygous. So we have the yellow, brown. Last would be recessive, recessive, homozygous recessive, dominant, dominant, homozygous dominant. So we have green, round. And that's it. So if you have heterozygous, then you have a lot of possible genotype, but there are only four possible phenotype. It could either be yellow round or green wrinkled or yellow wrinkled or green round. So those are the possibilities. So in the next slide, you are going to uh, predict the possible offspring, the possible genotypes of the offspring, given all the possible alleles of the parent.